Hello and welcome to this series of monthly online lectures discussing Joseph Ratzinger's landmark work, The Spirit of the Liturgy, and hosted by the Society for Catholic Liturgy. My name is Father James Bradley, and I'm the President of the Society for Catholic Liturgy and the moderator of today's session. A few housekeeping points before we begin. First, this session is being recorded. Secondly, with over 130 registrants, it's not possible to host a proper Q&A session during the talk today. We're confident that the presentation will speak for itself, but if you do want to keep the conversation going, I'd like to invite you to keep an eye on the Society's website for details of our 2025 annual conference, which will be held at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. from the 25th to the 26th of September next year, and which will be titled The Spirit of the Liturgy, the Liturgical Legacy of Joseph Ratzinger-Benedict XVI. Thirdly, whilst we look forward to today's lecture, we are already anticipating the next instalment at 4 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, November 7th, 2024, when Dr. Roland Milare will address the second chapter of The Spirit of the Liturgy, entitled Liturgy, Cosmos, History. The Spirit of the Liturgy was published in 2000, whilst its author was the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It was translated into English by the British priest and theologian John Saywood and published by Ignatius Press. This coming year, 2025, therefore marks the 25th anniversary of this, perhaps most famous of Joseph Ratzinger's works. True to the nature of the Society for Catholic Liturgy, over the course of these lectures, we'll hear from a range of experts across a number of fields and disciplines related to the sacred liturgy, each taking us through one of the 12 sections of the work and helping us to understand more fully and completely the impact that this little book can have on our own understanding of the sacred liturgy and how the work has already contributed to the lasting liturgical legacy of its author. Today's presentation is on the first chapter of The Spirit of the Liturgy, entitled Liturgy and Life, the Place of the Liturgy in Reality, and it is given by Dr. Timothy O'Malley of the University of Notre Dame. Dr. O'Malley is Professor of the Practice and Director of Education at the McGrath Institute for Church Life and Academic Director of the Notre Dame Center for Liturgy. He holds a concurrent appointment in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. He received his undergraduate degree, majoring in theology and philosophy, and his MTS in liturgical studies from the University of Notre Dame before completing a doctorate in theology and education at Boston College, focusing on an Augustinian approach to liturgical formation. In addition to his teaching, Dr. O'Malley is the author of a number of books on topics related to the liturgy, Christian initiation, the Eucharist, sacramental theology, marriage and family, and liturgical formation. He's also a former president of the Society for Catholic Liturgy, and for reasons that will shortly become apparent, is in high demand as a speaker and presenter. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Timothy O'Malley to address us today.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me here for the very first of this series, one that I have no doubt will be important for the life of the Church and the Academy alike. So thank you. I have before you slides that I'll take through. The presentation will take the form of a kind of lecture in the classical sense, attending to text, and I hope locating the spirit of the liturgy in some wider questions linked to Ratzinger's overall work. So I'm grateful for the invitation to reflect on liturgy and life, the place of liturgy and reality. That word reality is a potentially contentious one. It certainly is the case, right, that reality within sacramental theology refers to res, right? The sacramentum et res, the sacred sign and the reality. And in fact, it is quite possible to interpret or it's possible that others, I suppose, have interpreted Ratzinger on this point as linked to a certain kind of Platonic thought. So I want to begin this lecture by actually handling a prominent critique of Ratzinger and his liturgical sacramental thought, that of Liebenbruch. In Thinking Sacramental Presence in a Postmodern Context, Both writes, Ratzinger's Neoplatonic Augustinian vision of the world took shape during his early study of Augustine and Bonaventure. Reality possesses a binary, polar structure, which is fundamentally asymmetrical and hierarchical. The world radiates from a more real and more intelligible reality remaining beyond the world, from which the world came and to which it returns. Here, of course, he's hinting at the language of exitus et reditus, which will be dealt with more next week. Our world is said to be sacramentally structured in the sense that it points transparently to the eternal. In this connection, Ratzinger speaks of the sacramental grounding of human existence in the illumination of the world towards its eternal foundation. The human person also experiences who he or she really is, someone called by and to God. Sacraments aim consequently at the Einfügung in den Göttlichen Kosmos, the attunement or sensibility of awakening of a God-permeated cosmos. Both critiques this pre-modern approach, and incidentally, I think whatever he means by Neoplatonic, Augustine, and Bonaventure is underdefined. Nonetheless, he critiques this approach in a postmodern context. One writes where he says that such claims are an example of ontotheology, reducing God to being, and in fact takes Ratzinger to task for this, for attending, writes, more to some sort of ideal world than the concrete material existence. This sort of claim has been popularized often to sort of think about a kind of Platonic version of the liturgy versus a so-called Aristotelian that attends to the concrete ritual action versus the sort of ideal theological structure. Both himself, therefore, ends up proposing in this piece something quite distinct. He proposes a kind of postmodern liturgical understanding of reality and the liturgy. That is, the religiously experienced and interpreted relationship to the transcendent can thus no longer be conceived as pre-modern participation in salvific presence, right, in the Ratzinger sense, or as a modern anticipation of the ultimate identity. Here he takes to task other figures, including Edward Skillebecks. The Christian narrative, he writes, instead can only adequately open itself relative to the transcendent, right, can only adequately function in this way when it opens itself up, cultivating a sort of contemplative openness into which the transcendent as interruptive event can enter, right? And in other words, there is no givenness of the transcendent. It's interruptive. It comes in, it cracks, it's uncontrollable, right? Further, it bears witness in a non-hegemonic way to the transcendent with the help of its own always fragmentary words, images, stories, symbols, and rituals. There is no necessary metaphysics behind any liturgical act in both. It's but words, images that point towards something, and that is all. The sacramentality of existence points neither toward an ahistorical ontological depth inviting human similitude, right, an attunement of ourselves to that reality, nor a history whose fulfillment is ensured through a process of maturation, but instead the undermining of such self-assuring human constructions, right? So both any liturgical sacramental theology is not about an entrance into some real. In fact, it's a constant interruption and undermining of any presumptions we possess about what constitutes reality in the first place. The dilemma, I suspect, with this approach is it's, well, somewhat non-related to how human beings do, in fact, encounter transcendent things. This morning, I woke up on the following lake, and in fact, we'll be heading back there. This is the lake in Michigan where my son is camping out right now with his school, and I am one of the dad chaperones, which will necessitate sleeping with 12 fifth grade boys again in a cabin this evening. So do pray for my soul. But this morning, when we woke up and looked at the lake, I did not encounter many of the young people saying things like, wow, this must be some sort of fragmentary interruption, right, of some transcendent that merely like points towards something, but it cracks under all pressure, right? There was a sense of glory, of wonder in the cool Michigan air as we looked at the sun rise over this sort of ancient lake that has been created through the glaciers. Thus, what I seek to do in the rest of this lecture in direct dialogue with the spirit of the liturgy and works surrounding the spirit of the liturgy, a kind of situating spirit in the wider context of Ratzinger, therefore, is the following. Is Ratzinger a secret Neoplatonist who doesn't actually understand reality, who seeks an invitation to move beyond the material to the spiritual? And, right, if he doesn't, then what is that account? That account where the transcendent and the immanent go together. I want to then take a step into a very different space, right, than the spirit of the liturgy, a work that's also featured in Ratzinger's complete works on the liturgy, the sacramental foundation of Christian existence. And Ratzinger notes at the beginning of this work that the modern person, or shall we say the postmodern person, struggles with sacramentality. They do not perceive a world that immediately gives itself in vision to God. Oversimplifying, he writes somewhat, one can indeed say that the sacramental idea presupposes a symbolist understanding of the world, whereas the contemporary understanding of the world is functionalist. It sees things merely as things, as a function of human labor and accomplishment. And given such a starting point, it is no longer possible to understand how a thing can become a sacrament. Right? When human existence, when creation is treated as mere techne, something for one's use, then the world speaks no meaning beyond what it does as an it, rather than an opening into a thou, a kind of iconicity, right, that opens up to the grandeur of God, a Maximus the Confessor's logoi of the logos, right? And it's in fact not that the world has changed, but that the human person's capacity to understand the world has changed, not in a sacramental mode to reality, but a merely functional one. What's fascinating about Ratzinger, and that clearly goes against Boeff's claim, is he grounds his argument not in some sort of Neoplatonic account of reality, but in fact with natural religion, natural religiosity, the human person's way of marking reality. He describes in this work what is biological in man as an entity that exists spiritually, acquires a different meaning and a new depth. Human eating is something different from the food intake of an animal. Eating attains its human dimension by becoming a meal, right? For my anniversary, I do not take my beloved spouse, my wife, to McDonald's. This is not something that she desires. It is a functional view of food, food that is consumed actually rather quickly. Instead, we splurge and we go to one of the best restaurants in northern Indiana, Artisan, which is in Elkhart. We go there and we spend an hour and a half, 2 hours speaking to one another about what our relationship means, right? The eating is not a merely functional reality. Eating takes on this dimension of meal, of sharing, that there's something about the act of consumption that cannot be reduced to bios from the beginning, but has a kind of logos to it. Ratzinger also describes in this work a version of sacraments that pertain to dimensions beyond the purely natural, right? Food, eating, sex, and death, but attends to history, those key markers and moments by which the specifically human dimension of man, from which his individual and collective history accrues to him, a history that represents what is special and unique about him as opposed to the everlasting sameness of cosmic death and becoming. My own university recently inaugurated a new president, and at this inauguration, certain things were done, right? In some ways, you could view the inauguration of a president at a university as a purely functional event. Give the man the keys and tell him to get to work in this case. But that's not what unfolded, right? He was given a medal, a mace, right? Not to beat off protesters, but as a symbol or seal of his identity in his office. He was blessed by the former presidents who offered a prayer over him, right? One can think about the same dimension relative to kingship or coronation, right? This moment of marking the transition in a way that's profoundly human, but profoundly meaningful. In that sense, it's really hard to see Ratzinger as describing any dimension of his sort of grounding of sacraments in something like a kind of Neoplatonic structure. Instead, it's the God who creates and leaves evidence of that created dimension at the very heart of what it means to be human. This universal form of the sacrament in the history of religion is therefore at first simply the expression of the experience that God encounters man in a human way, in the signs of common humanity and the change of the merely biological into the human, which, when accomplished in the context of a religion, undergoes a transformation into a third dimension, the authentication of the divine and the human. So rather than see Ratzinger as sort of inviting some climbing out of materiality to some Platonic logos, it's in fact that logos that's inscribed in the created order. History of religions, natural religiosity, right, describes the human dimensions necessary by which the person encounters God. And in fact, it's those dimensions that are transformed and by which, right, divine encounter unfolds. Now, Ratzinger, importantly, does not stop there, right? Not only does he not lead into a purely sort of Neoplatonic account, but his rather is an entrance into history, the reality of history that's made possible through the incarnation of the Word. For after all, dear friends, I invite us to think about this fact. If we are attend to the purely natural dimension of creation, there's no evidence that transcendence leads to an encounter with goodness, right? It can lead to the kind of fragmentary dimensions described by both. Who has not trembled in peril as you've seen a hawk attack a creature and destroy it, right? It's very difficult to look at such an image and say, well, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. I mean, I suppose it is, but there is a kind of horrific dimension of it that attends. There's also the reality, right, of there are two different reactions to going to a planetarium I've noticed in my life. The first is you're in awe before the starry sky. The second, you're terrified, coming to recognize that you're a minuscule dot in a cosmos much larger than yourself, right? You could be a pure accident of existence, right? Left alone on this island, right? And in that sense, the God who exists might in fact be nothing at all. Natural religiosity need not lead to an encounter with God, to something upward. Instead, as Ratzinger notes, what happens is the immersion of this natural human dimension into the holistic theological history of the God who acts. As he describes in his own Introduction to Christianity, a work that was inspired so many well before he wrote Spirit, Christian belief is not merely concerned with the eternal, which as the entirely other would remain completely outside of the human world and time. On the contrary, it is much more concerned with God in history, with God as man, right? As God as human. There, right, is taken up, the word becomes flesh and takes up, that's all of human, into the very identity of God, right? It's taken up and entered in, and therefore to be human is never to be the same. This historical dimension is what gives the sacraments their meaning. As he notes on 163 to 164 in the Theology of the Liturgy of this work I've been working with relative to the sacraments, which I promise will pay off relative to Spirit here in a moment, he describes the sort of sacraments, therefore, as an immersion into the very reality of history, right? Oh, good. With that, we can return to the Christian sacraments, he writes, whose meaning is none other than the assertion of man into the historical context that comes from Christ. To receive the Christian sacraments means to enter into the history proceeding from Christ, with the belief that this is the saving history that opens up to man the historical context that truly allows him to live and leads him into his true uniqueness, into the unity with God that is his eternal future. Recapitulating, we can determine in what sense the sacraments are fundamental for Christian existence. First of all, they express that vertical dimension of human existence, the call of God that makes a man human in the first place. None of this is even remotely, by the way, Platonic. But they also point beyond that to the horizontal dimension of the history of faith that comes to us from Christ, from human existence in its concrete form. It is historically mediated and comes into its own only through this mediation. It is in fact where Ratzinger draws, and it's what opens up that intro to the Spirit, is that it is the history of divine love, the history of divine life that's poured out that allows one to enter into this reality. Worship is no mere plaything, no mere aesthetic exercise. Worship is, in fact, an immersion into the history of God's activity, hic et nunc, here and now, and it's quite serious for that reason. That is why, and I think I take this text as a kind of hinge by which connecting the spirit of the liturgy to everything that will then follow in Ratzinger, is that liturgy implies a real relationship with another who reveals himself to us and gives our existence a new direction. Here, once again, we have no Neoplatonic framework. Rather, through materiality, through the signs and symbols of the liturgical act, there's a genuine relationship with another. It's why Ratzinger begins this chapter in this work through a description of the serious play of the child, right? Not the kind of playfulness of the liturgy in which one can do whatever one wants, but a serious playfulness of the child who desires in some sense to return to the fundamental identity of the child as son or daughter. It's that real relationship mediated, who reveals himself, that other, to us and gives our existence that new direction, that new horizon toward a future, a new reality. In fact, it is this, in fact, capacious, humanizing account of sacred liturgy that comes to inform later Benedict XVI's own Sacramentum Caritatis, or sacrament of charity. He knits together liturgy, life, and reality, drawing from themes from the spirit of the liturgy quite clearly. And I want to especially highlight sections at the very end in the mystery to be lived to describe the Eucharist. Christianity's new worship includes and transfigures every aspect of life. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Christians in all their actions are called to offer true worship to God. Here, the intrinsically Eucharistic nature of Christian life begins to take shape. The Eucharist, since it embraces the concrete everyday existence of the believer, makes possible day by day the progressive transfiguration of all those called by grace to reflect the image of the Son of God, right? It is here, there is no sort of departure or a transcending of human materiality. In fact, it's human materiality that comes to take on a new meaning in this Eucharistic dimension, whereby in humanity, one is called to reflect now with grace the image of the Son of God. This continues on, right, for Ratzinger, so clearly in the next portion of this quote. There's nothing authentically human, our thoughts and our affections, our words and our deeds, that does not find in the sacrament of the Eucharist the form it needs to be lived to the full. Here we can see the full human import of the radical newness brought by Christ in the Eucharist. The worship of God in our lives cannot be relegated to something private and individual, but tends by its nature to permeate every aspect of our existence. Worship pleasing to God becomes a new way of living our whole life, each particular moment of which is lifted up, since it's lived as part of a relationship with Christ, as an offering to God. The glory of God is the living man, and the life of man is the vision of God. Right, in this capacious initiation into liturgical reality, there is no transcending of that materiality. It's that materiality that's transfigured in the process. It is the entrance into a reality not apart from this world, but one where this world in all of its material dimensions is transformed. It is why, and here I move toward a conclusion, that when you read much of Ratzinger's work around the liturgy, you see nothing like this Neoplatonic account of sacramentality, an example of the material versus the ideal real. Instead, it is that transformation of reality in Christ of all materiality that now promises a transformation of this materiality in this moment. In a lecture he gave for a Eucharistic Congress in Italy, it's again in this volume on the theology of the liturgy, Eucharist, Communio, Solidarity. He describes what unfolds with the transformation of the Eucharistic elements. The transformed bread, the transformed wine, in which the Lord gives himself as a life-giving spirit, are there in order to transform us so that we may become one bread with him and then one body with him. The transformation of the gifts is not the point of arrival. Rather, it is in turn a beginning. Ratzinger, throughout this piece, describes that transformation, right? That the fundamental transformation is, in fact, the Lord's transformation of death into life. right? That transformation comes about through the resurrection, and the material signs of the Eucharist in their materiality are now transformed into the body and blood of Christ as signs intended to be consumed and eaten, right? They also pledge and transform the transformation of the recipient, who is to become now like this gift. Again, you see here a very clear initiation into reality through the liturgy, through the work of worship. And in fact, the sacrifice of the liturgy promises this. Again, in Sacramentum Caritatis, Benedict describes the moment of the institution, right, of Christ transforming death into new life. By placing his gift in this context, Jesus shows the salvific meaning of his death and resurrection, a mystery which renews history and the whole cosmos. The institution of the Eucharist demonstrates how Jesus' death, for all its violence and absurdity, became in him a supreme act of love and mankind's definitive deliverance from evil. In the Eucharist, in that institution narrative remembered at every Mass, there is no escaping from reality, but at last an understanding of reality that death does not have victory, that as the Song of Songs notes, love is stronger than death. And it is that mystery which is celebrated on the altar, that mystery that presents the reality of divine love, God's own exitus, and the capacity to offer that reditus, the return gift of self as an act of love. It is why, in addressing the reality of the liturgy in the very first chapter, Ratzinger's major concern is to turn outward from the self, from the community that affirms its own goodness, that celebrates liturgy for its own sake, and instead celebrates liturgy for the reality that becomes present in every liturgical act. It is the Lord who comes to save, who comes to heal, who comes to heal our memories and our understanding and our desire, and bring us back in wholeness to the Father to sing in that communion of saints. And incidentally, if you were to actually describe Ratzinger's own Augustinian Bonaventurian sort of approach, this is closer to the reality than merely calling it a kind of Neoplatonic escape from reality, a bifurcation into the real and the unreal. So in conclusion, friends, the task of this lecture was merely twofold. To answer the question, is Ratzinger a secret Neoplatonist? No. His involvement with divine revelation, his attention to natural religiosity, makes him much more the kind of thinker that attends to the created order, not as unimportant, but exceedingly important in all of its materiality, as a sign that points toward a reality. And when something points towards that reality, that doesn't mean the sign doesn't matter. It actually gives more importance to the act of signification. Second, and I think I've hinted in that last comment, Ratzinger's sacramental vision is connected to reality. The transcendent and the immanent go together. The meal, right, the festive meal points towards something else. And that meal is transformed in the history that comes from Christ into an act of self-giving love of the God-man to which the human person is invited to participate. So liturgy does invite us into reality, to live that reality in the words of Romans 12, to make of our bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to the Lord. That sacrifice that's possible because the created order is already marked by the wisdom of that sacrifice, by the reality that, as he concludes all of Spirit with the liturgy, God is love. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. O'Malley, on behalf of the Board of Directors and the entire Society for Catholic Liturgy. Thank you for your words today. This was, as I said at the beginning, just the first of a series of monthly lectures on the spirit of the liturgy that will lead up to our annual conference at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. in September 2025 on the topic, the liturgical legacy of Joseph Ratzinger-Benedict XVI. Please visit the website of the Society for Catholic Liturgy, liturgysociety.org, for information about that conference and also about membership of our society. And I hope very much that you'll be able to join us for the next lecture at 4 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, November 7th, 2024, when Dr. Roland Malari will address the second chapter of the Spirit of the Liturgy, entitled Liturgy, Cosmos, History. Thank you very much.